Well, welcome back. We're just continuing our discussion about desire and the affections. And really, one of the reasons I was putting these little videos, these walk and talks together, was as much for myself to help me start to think through. I'm looking at the possibility of a little book project. And that means that I would want to start to flesh out some of these things in writing, but hopefully you'll be getting a feel of the shape of what such a book might look like if you follow through these videos. And just to give you a feel of where we are, we've done some biblical and systematic theology. We've dug deep into some Bible texts. We've tried to sketch out the contours of this anatomy of desire and affections. And I think we're probably moving into that stage where we can potentially come into land. So a couple of things I want to do. I want to think a bit more about how we kind of end up cultivating our desire. So I'm going to talk about, these next two videos will be about how do we cultivate desire. And I want to suggest that there are two ways that we cultivate it. One way is that we cultivate it by entertaining wrong desires, evil desires. That's one way that we cultivate desire. That's what we shouldn't do. And in fact, I would suggest that technical term, concupiscence, is really all about that as much as anything. It is about the cultivation of wrong desire. So it's not just about, I think when you read carefully, you read people back through history, Augustine, Calvin, everyone else, you realise that that's what they're really talking about. Not just talking about the seed desire, the temptation itself. They are thinking about this whole picture of what we cultivate. I will come back to that shortly. But secondly, we want to think about how we cultivate good desire. I want to do that very practically. I suspect that in terms of a book, we'll be in a position really to flesh out some of the examples and some scenarios, just to think about our own lives, how we face temptation, how we resist it, how we put sin to death, how we go about saying no to wrong desire so that we don't cultivate it, we stop cultivating it, we pull it up by its roots and kill it, and how we cultivate good desire. And it will be helpful to do that with some examples. Now, I may or may not do that through the video series here, but certainly if I do a book, that's where we'll be starting to land, to make it as helpful and practical as possible. And then we'll probably wrap it up with a conclusion. So I may or may not do some of those scenario videos. I may go straight to the conclusion, but that's where we're kind of heading. So definitely 3 more videos to come, or that's including this one, so 2 more after this, possibly more. But today, let's just focus in and home in on the danger of cultivating evil desire. And as I said, I think that is, as I read some of the historical theologians, I think that's what they were trying to get at when they talked about concupiscence, that they were talking about not just the sort of the seed desire itself, but about its cultivation. And that is why they wanted to insist that concupiscence was not just tending towards sin, not just a source of sin, but was itself sinful. Because they were thinking about the whole picture, from the roots through to the fruit, and saying that you've got to look at the whole thing together and say, is it sin? And I think they would say, because of that, yes. But I also want to suggest that in terms of making that assessment of is the whole thing sin, we need to see the fruit. Jesus says that you know whether a tree is good and the roots are good or evil or bad by the fruit. And that's why we need to look at outcomes. Now, when I talk about fruit and outcomes, I'm not just talking about actions. I'm not talking about when we say things or do things. I'm not just talking about what is going on externally. I'm talking about the inner life as well, although that is harder to see from the outside, and it really is dependent on the person themselves, being honest, and in fact, depending on the convicting work of the Holy Spirit. Because there can be fruit in all kinds of ways in our lives beyond the actions. And remember, Jesus said that it isn't just the act of adultery, it's not just the act of murder that is sin, that condemns us outside of Christ, but it is what goes on in our heart as well. Because what we are doing there is we're growing, we are cultivating, we are preparing the fruit. And the fruit may be seen in a thought or a word or a deed, but it is being cultivated in that place. So that's where we want to start to think about what happens when we cultivate wrong desire. And in fact, we are cultivating and we are growing sin. And in fact, James would say, we are growing death. A lot of big stuff to follow up in a different place there, isn't there? Are we growing and cultivating death by cultivating and growing sin, by growing and cultivating wrong desire? Or are we growing and cultivating life that arises out of good desires? And therefore, good thoughts, good words, good deeds. And I think here is the point. And that's probably where the actual scenarios will be helpful. We cultivate the desire when we do not resist temptation. So what happens? I have a desire. It arises out of that desire for comfort or security or for identity. And something somewhere in my consciousness starts to awaken and say that that desire could be met by and you can fill in the gap. And that is the point. I believe that we are called to resist it. We either say no at that point. No, I'm not going to entertain that desire. No, that is wrong. Or we begin to cultivate it. We begin to entertain it. And that is where we slip into sin. And that is, for example, particularly when we think about sex and sexuality, where the word lust has tended to be used, although it historically had a broader meaning. When we think about broader desires and temptations, we might talk about things like coveting. And I also would suggest that we would feed into that in terms of our affections. I think that's where you start to see things like jealousy, bitterness, anger and hatred, that they start to form as we cultivate the desire and the affection. So jealousy is a form of desire, isn't it? It is a desire for me to benefit at the expense of others. Hatred is a desire for the harm of others, in order that I may benefit, in order that I may experience security, greater comfort, greater identity. And bitterness is a type of desire as well. So it's a sort of a pity, and it's a desire for vindication. It's a desire for me to be in the right. It often comes with a desire for attention, again for identity, for reassurance, for comfort and security. Again, but what you can see there is how, whether it's through lust, or jealousy and envy, or bitterness and hatred, you can see how we're beginning to cultivate, to grow that wrong affection, that wrong desire. So what do? We do a few things. First, I think we begin to justify ourselves. That's another example why it's sinful. So I begin to believe that I am excused or even justified in at least entertaining the desire. And I can do that in all kinds of ways. I can do it by minimizing the sinfulness itself, because it's not really sin. I've not done anything. But even pretending that we are still at the temptation state. I can justify it by saying it is okay for me to do this in my situation. And that's particularly when it arises out of something where there is a legitimacy, that I can justify what is in fact bitterness by saying, well, look, I have been mistreated, I have been wronged. And alongside that, we justified or excuse it by misnaming it. So I failed to call it out what it is. I failed to say, this is bitterness, this is jealousy, this is lust. So there's that challenge of self-justification and self-excuse. And that gives us the permission to entertain it. We start to think about it. We meditate on it, to use a word often used in other contexts. That's where our minds naturally go. We research it. And so, for example, that in terms of lust is where the problem with pornography comes in. Pornography is a way of researching my lust, feeding my lust by providing the resources, the food, which will help that lust, that wrong desire to grow. And you can fill in the gaps for other types of desire, and we may talk about them at different points. So I justify it, I entertain it, by beginning to picture how I would fulfill it, how, and because at that stage what I'm doing is I'm beginning to picture the fruit. And I entertain it. When I feed it, and I feed the desire. with the very things that will help it to grow. Anything that isn't cutting it off at source. I think there's one other way in which we cultivate desire, when we cultivate unhealthy, sinful, evil desire. And that is harder to spot because it looks good. Again, I can be cultivating my desire when I think that I'm trying to kill it. And that happens when I look for the wrong ways to deal with it. When instead of going to the gospel, instead of depending on the Holy Spirit, I depend on my own strength, my own ability, or I look for solutions that are offered. So effectively, when I look to superstition and when I look to legalism, and some of those can be deeply spiritual, kind of, things like, this is where the Wesleyan higher life perfectionism, sort of holiness movement has its problems, its dangers. The belief that I can escape my desires by having this special spiritual experience. I've written before about the three related ways that we try to live lives that are pleasing to God that end up an absolute mess. I've described them as legalism, license and superstition, or magic. Legalism is I try to follow rules, I try to do things to distract, or to do things to atone, make it better. License, when I excuse or justify myself. Magic or superstition, when I look for this sort of mystical intervention that is anything other than actually what God says in His Word is the remedy. So there are some brief thoughts on cultivating desire when we're thinking about cultivating wrong desire. But actually we want to cultivate good and godly and right desire, don't we? So we'll talk about that next time.